I told my husband my DMs were full of men who would treat me better than him. He said maybe I should go find one of them. That was the last time I saw him as my husband. It was a Saturday evening in late September. We were supposed to go to Marcus and Amy's barbecue, one of those end-of-summer gatherings where everyone pretends the approaching winter isn't going to change everything. I'd been ready for over an hour, standing in front of our bedroom mirror, adjusting the strap of my sundress for the 10th time, checking my lipstick, waiting. The clock on our kitchen wall ticked past 7:30. Julian was supposed to be home by 6. This had become our new normal. Me waiting, him running late. Both of us pretending it didn't matter as much as it did. I found myself on the couch, scrolling through my phone with the desperate energy of someone trying to fill a void. Instagram stories of friends at brunches I wasn't invited to, Twitter arguments about things that didn't matter, and then the messages. Always the messages. A notification popped up from someone named Brad Chicago 87. Another compliment about a photo I'd posted weeks ago. I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. I let it sit there, a small validation in a life that had started to feel increasingly hollow. The front door finally opened, with the sound of exhaustion. Keys dropping too heavily. Footsteps that dragged rather than walked. Julian appeared in the doorway, looking like he'd been fighting a war in his kitchen. His chef's coat was stained with things I couldn't identify. His hair matted with sweat. His face carrying that haunted look I'd been seeing more and more lately. He didn't look at me when he said he needed a quick shower. The words came out flat, automatic, like he was talking to a coworker rather than his wife. That's when something inside me snapped. I stood up from the couch, my phone still clutched in my hand like evidence, and let him know exactly how I felt about being an afterthought in his increasingly complicated life. I told him we were already embarrassingly late. I reminded him that this was supposed to be our time, our friends, our life together. His response was equally flat. Something about the kitchen being slammed, about a new employee who couldn't handle the pressure, about the endless demands of running a restaurant that was finally getting the recognition he'd dreamed of since culinary school. But I was past caring about his explanations. I was tired of competing with sauté pans and prep lists and restaurant critics for my husband's attention. So I said the thing I'd been thinking for weeks, the thing that had been growing in the dark corners of my resentment like some toxic plant. I told him about the messages, about all the men who found time to notice me, to compliment me, to make me feel like I existed. I suggested these strangers would treat me better than the man I'd married, the man who couldn't even remember to come home on time for a simple barbecue. Julian's face didn't change when I said it, didn't harden with anger or soften with hurt. He just nodded once, like I'd confirmed something he'd been suspecting for a long time. Then he told me maybe I should go find one of those men who would appreciate me properly. There was no yelling, no dramatic slamming of doors or throwing of objects. He simply picked up his keys from the bowl by our front door and left our apartment with the quiet finality of someone who had already made his decision. I stood there in my sundress, lipstick still perfect, listening to the silence that followed. Maybe I should start from the beginning, because disasters like this don't just explode out of nowhere. They build slowly, quietly, in the spaces between what we say and what we mean. They unravel thread by thread until you're standing in the wreckage, wondering how something that felt so solid could disappear so completely. I met Julian 4 years ago at Mian, a small restaurant in the Arts District, where I waited tables, and he commanded the kitchen with the intensity of a general leading troops into battle. I was 26 and still believing my English degree would eventually lead to something meaningful. He was 28 and already making a name for himself in the local food scene. Watching him work was like watching someone speak a language I'd never learned, but desperately wanted to understand. He moved behind the line with purpose and precision, orchestrating chaos into beauty, turning raw ingredients into something that could make people cry with happiness. When the tickets backed up during weekend rushes and servers started panicking, Julian would become even more focused, more deliberate, like pressure was something he thrived on rather than crumbled under. There was something magnetic about his concentration, the way he could make perfect risotto while coordinating 3 other dishes, never losing track of timing or temperature or the exact moment when something needed his attention. His hands, always moving, always creating, fascinated me in ways I didn't fully understand at first. After my shifts, I'd often find myself lingering at the bar with a glass of wine, pretending to count tips while really watching him clean his station. He had rituals that bordered on sacred. The way he wiped down every surface, arranged his knives in perfect order, checked and double-checked that everything was ready for the next day. There was something almost meditative about his process, like he was trying to bring order to a world that specialized in chaos. One night, he caught me staring and made a comment about how I didn't need to wait around for him. I lied and said I wasn't waiting, that I was just finishing up my paperwork. He smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months of working together, and suggested we get some real food since we'd both been living off kitchen scraps and coffee for too long. We ended up at an all-night diner, the kind of place that attracts insomniacs and shift workers and people who've forgotten what normal mealtimes are supposed to look like. We talked until the sun started coming up, sharing stories about our families, our dreams, the paths that had led us to serving other people's hunger while ignoring our own. He told me about growing up in his grandmother's kitchen, how she'd taught him that cooking wasn't just about feeding people's bodies, but about nurturing their souls. Food was love made tangible, she'd said, and Julian had built his entire career around that philosophy. I told him about the novel I'd been working on for 3 years, how it was about two people who kept almost finding each other, but never quite managing to close the distance. When he asked what the book was really about, I admitted it was about the space between wanting something and having it, about how sometimes the anticipation is more beautiful than the reality could ever be. He looked at me across that sticky diner table with coffee stains and maple syrup residue and asked if I'd figured out the ending yet. I told him I was still working on it, still trying to decide whether my characters would find each other or whether the almost finding was the whole point. Looking back now, I think that conversation was the beginning of everything, including the end. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, with his grandmother's ring in Amy's garden, surrounded by the tomato plants he'd helped her start from seeds. Our wedding was small, intimate, held in the same garden where he'd asked me to marry him. Julian cooked for all our guests afterward, creating a meal that tasted like promises and felt like the beginning of something extraordinary. Our honeymoon phase lasted longer than most people's entire relationships. We took road trips to nowhere special, just driving until we found something interesting. A farmer's market, a historic inn, a hiking trail that led to views that made us believe in magic. We'd have dinner dates that turned into breakfast dates, staying up all night talking about everything and nothing. Julian would leave little notes in my laptop bag, usually when I wasn't looking. Simple things like reminders that my novel was going to be beautiful, or grocery lists written in the form of haikus, or just his name next to mine, like he was trying to make our connection permanent through repetition. I'd text him pictures of interesting ingredients I found at markets, asking if they sparked any culinary inspiration. He'd come home with dirt under his fingernails from the restaurant's garden, talking excitedly about heirloom varieties and seasonal menus, and the way certain herbs could transform a simple dish into something transcendent. I'd read him paragraphs from whatever I was writing, watching his face for reactions, loving how he'd ask questions that made me think about my characters in new ways. We fit together like we'd been designed specifically for each other, like some cosmic architect had planned our compatibility down to the smallest details. But life has a way of creeping in slowly, so gradually that you don't notice the changes until you're already drowning in them. It started with Julian's hours getting longer, as Mian gained recognition from food critics and local magazines. 12-hour days became 14-hour days, then 16-hour marathons that left him barely able to hold coherent conversations. Success, it turned out, was more demanding than failure had ever been. He'd come home exhausted, moving through our apartment like a ghost of himself. When I'd ask about his day, I'd get single-word responses that felt more like dismissals than communication. Everything was either fine or busy or tired, as if his entire emotional vocabulary had been reduced to restaurant industry shorthand. The little notes stopped appearing in my laptop bag. My texts about farmers market finds would go unread for hours, sometimes days. When I'd show him photos of ingredients that used to excite him, he'd glance at my phone with the kind of polite interest you'd show a stranger's vacation pictures. Gradually, Julian seemed to be disappearing, even when he was physically present. He'd sit next to me on the couch, scrolling through his phone or reviewing inventory lists, but it felt like he was somewhere else entirely. Like his body was going through the motions of being my husband, while his mind lived permanently in that kitchen, solving problems I couldn't help with, fighting battles I couldn't understand. We stopped touching the way we used to. Not dramatically, not after some big fight or revelation. The casual intimacy just faded. No more absent-minded hand-holding during movies. No more sleepy kisses goodnight. No more of those moments when he'd pull me close just because I was there, and he was there, and being together felt like the most natural thing in the world. I'd lie in bed next to him, listening to his breathing, feeling lonelier than I had when I was actually single. At least when I was alone, I could call it solitude instead of abandonment. At least when I was alone, I wasn't constantly measuring the distance between what I needed and what I was getting. The direct messages started innocently enough, the way these things always do. Old friends from college reaching out after seeing my posts, comments on Instagram photos that gradually moved into private conversations. Men I barely remembered from high school would send messages about how good I looked, how happy I seemed, how lucky my husband was to have someone like me. At first, I'd screenshot the weird ones and show them to Julian, laughing about the audacity of strangers sliding into married women's DMs. But Julian barely glanced at my phone anymore, just made non-committal sounds that might have been amusement or agreement or complete indifference. So I stopped showing him. The messages felt good in a way I hadn't expected. They felt like proof that I still existed, that someone somewhere was paying attention to the details of my life. A guy named Marcus, not our friend Marcus, but someone from my college journalism class, would send thoughtful responses to my Instagram stories, remembering things I'd posted weeks earlier. Another one, David, would ask about my writing progress, actually engaging with my answers, instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. One Tuesday evening, while Julian worked late again, David sent a message asking how my novel was coming along. I stared at the question for a long time, trying to remember the last time Julian had asked me anything about my writing. It had been months, maybe longer. I found myself typing back that it was going slowly but surely, thanking him for asking. When David responded that he'd love to read it someday, that he was sure it would be incredible, I smiled at my phone screen. Actually smiled, for the first time in weeks. I started checking my messages more frequently, looking forward to those small moments of validation, those reminders that someone found me interesting enough to remember, engaging enough to pursue conversations with. I began hiding my phone screen when Julian was around, though he was rarely looking in my direction anyway. Our arguments started over increasingly trivial things. Dishes left in the sink overnight, forgetting to buy milk, him being 20 minutes late to dinner with my parents. But underneath all those surface irritations was something much deeper and more dangerous. The growing chasm of things we weren't saying to each other. I'd find myself complaining that he was never really present anymore, that I felt like I was living with a roommate rather than a husband. His responses were always about the pressures of running a successful restaurant, about having to prove himself in an industry that chewed up and spit out even talented chefs, about building something that would last beyond the immediate gratification of a single perfect meal. The most honest conversation we had during those months was when I finally admitted that I felt like I was competing with his restaurant for his attention and losing badly. Julian looked at me with eyes that seemed older than they had just months before, and confessed that he didn't know how to balance everything anymore, that he felt like he was failing at everything simultaneously. It was the most vulnerable he'd been with me in months, but instead of feeling like a breakthrough, it felt like a confession, like he'd already decided which parts of his life were worth fighting for, and which ones he was willing to sacrifice for the greater good of his career. After Julian walked out that Saturday night, I spent hours waiting for him to come back. His toothbrush was still in the bathroom holder. His favorite coffee mug was still in the sink, waiting to be washed. His side of the bed still carried the faint scent of his cologne and the restaurant smells that clung to his skin, garlic and herbs, and something indefinably warm. I called his phone repeatedly, getting voicemail every time. I sent text messages that ranged from angry to apologetic to desperate, all of them met with silence. It was like he'd simply vanished from existence, leaving behind only the physical evidence that he'd once shared this space with me. The direct messages kept coming, more frequently than usual. Word travels fast in social circles, especially when drama is involved, and somehow everyone seemed to know that Julian and I had fought. My phone became a constant stream of concerned friends and opportunistic strangers, all offering different versions of support. Messages poured in suggesting that I deserved better treatment, that I should be with someone who appreciated my worth, that they'd been waiting for me to realize I was too good for my situation. Men I barely knew suddenly became experts on my marriage, offering advice and alternatives with equal confidence. But sitting alone in our apartment, surrounded by the ghost of our shared life, those messages felt hollow rather than validating. They felt cheap, opportunistic, like people were trying to capitalize on my pain rather than actually caring about my well-being. None of them knew that Julian hummed old jazz standards while he cooked, so softly you had to be standing right next to him to hear it. None of them knew he kept a photo of his grandmother tucked into his knife roll, or that he'd named his sourdough starter after her. None of them knew he used to trace letters on my back when he couldn't sleep, spelling out words he was too tired to say aloud, but needed me to understand anyway. None of them knew me the way Julian did, the way Julian used to, before everything got so complicated. Months passed in a haze of routine and avoidance. I stopped working on my novel, unable to concentrate on fictional characters when my real life felt like it was written by someone with a cruel sense of irony. I stopped going out with friends, tired of their well-meaning advice and poorly concealed curiosity about my marriage's spectacular implosion. Amy called constantly, leaving voicemails about how Julian was hurting too, how I should swallow my pride and reach out to him. But pride is a terrible thing once it takes root. It builds walls that are easier to maintain than tear down, especially when you're not sure what's waiting on the other side. I developed small routines that made me feel like I had some control over my increasingly chaotic emotional landscape. Grocery shopping on Wednesday evenings became sacred, a predictable ritual in a world that had lost all its reliable patterns. Same store, same route through the aisles, same brands I'd been buying since Julian and I first moved in together. I was standing in the frozen food section one evening in early December, reaching for a bag of mixed vegetables, the kind Julian always said were nutritionally pointless, but convenient for someone who'd forgotten how to cook for one person, when I turned the corner and saw him. He was standing by the ice cream freezer, laughing at something the woman next to him had said. The sound hit me like a physical blow, because I'd forgotten what his genuine laughter sounded like, how it used to make me feel like I was part of some private joke that only we understood. Julian looked different than I remembered. Thinner, definitely, but there was something else too. He looked lighter somehow, like some invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. His posture was more relaxed than it had been in months before our separation, and his face had lost that perpetual exhaustion that had become his default expression. The woman standing next to him was tall and elegant in the way that comes from confidence rather than effort. She wore no makeup that I could detect, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that somehow looked more sophisticated than anything I'd managed with hot tools and expensive products. She was holding a carton of mint chocolate chip ice cream, making some comment that clearly delighted Julian in ways I hadn't managed to do in months. They weren't touching, weren't displaying obvious romantic affection, but there was an intimacy in their proximity that felt more threatening than hand-holding would have. They stood close together in the way that people do when they're comfortable with each other, when personal space has become a shared commodity rather than something that needs to be negotiated. Julian looked up, and our eyes met across the frozen foods aisle. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his expression. Surprise, maybe? Or sadness? Or regret? Then his face settled into polite neutrality, and he nodded at me the way you'd acknowledge a neighbor you recognized but didn't really know. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there holding my bag of frozen vegetables while my husband, my estranged husband, smiled at another woman like she was the most fascinating person he'd ever encountered. They started walking away, their shopping cart rolling between us like a physical barrier to any interaction we might have attempted. As they passed by my aisle, I caught fragments of their conversation. Something about lab work updates being sent later, his response about how much help she'd already provided, her casual mention of review appointments and follow-up procedures. The clinical language registered in my brain without immediately making sense. Lab work, review appointments, follow-up procedures. I stood frozen in the middle of the frozen food aisle, watching my husband disappear around the corner with a woman who spoke the language of medical professionals. Later, when they were at the checkout counter, and I was pretending to shop for yogurt in the dairy section, I walked past their cart with the desperate curiosity of someone who needed to understand what she was seeing. The woman's purse was open, a manila folder visible inside with papers that looked official and important. Please subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and let us know in the comments what city you're from. Your support means everything to us. A name tag was clipped to the folder's edge, the kind medical professionals wear to identify themselves in hospitals and clinics. Dr. Alicia Grant, Oncology. Oncology. The word hit me like cold water, washing away months of anger and resentment and replacing them with a terrible, crystal-clear understanding. All those late nights I'd attributed to his obsession with work. All those exhausted expressions I'd interpreted as him pulling away from our marriage. All those distant looks I'd taken as evidence that he'd stopped loving me. He hadn't been choosing his restaurant over me. He'd been fighting for his life while I was counting compliments from strangers who didn't know my middle name. I drove home in a state of shock so complete that I'm surprised I didn't cause an accident. My hands were shaking as I unlocked our apartment door, my vision blurry with tears I didn't remember starting to cry. I sat on our bed, my bed now, I supposed, and closed my eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered and what it meant for everything I thought I understood about the end of my marriage. All those months when I'd convinced myself that Julian was growing cold and distant, when I'd interpreted his exhaustion as indifference and his preoccupation as rejection, he'd been dealing with something infinitely more serious than restaurant reviews and menu planning. He'd been sick, probably scared, probably trying to process the biggest crisis of his life while maintaining the facade of normalcy that his career demanded. And instead of being the partner he needed during the most frightening experience a person can face, I'd been collecting validation from men who wanted nothing more than to be a temporary distraction from my real life. While Julian was sitting in oncology waiting rooms, filling out insurance forms, learning medical vocabulary that no one should have to master, I was getting offended that he didn't have energy left over to appreciate my Instagram posts or remember to buy milk on his way home from what I now realized weren't just long days at work, but long days at work followed by medical appointments he was handling alone. I thought about all the conversations we didn't have, all the questions I didn't ask, all the support I didn't offer, because I was too busy feeling sorry for myself to notice that my husband was disappearing for reasons that had nothing to do with our marriage and everything to do with his mortality. I could have asked why he seemed so tired all the time, if there was something wrong beyond the usual restaurant stress. I could have offered to go with him to whatever appointments kept making him late, instead of assuming he was prioritizing work over our relationship. I could have said that I missed the connection we used to have, that I was scared we were losing each other, that whatever was happening, we could face it together, like the team we'd promised to be when we got married. Instead, I'd weaponized his worst fears about not being enough, about failing the people he loved, about being abandoned when he was most vulnerable. I'd taken every insecurity he'd ever shared with me during our most intimate moments and turned them into ammunition for the cruelest thing I could think to say. I'd told a dying man